Danny Rolling entered Florida with the goal of becoming a superstar among criminals. At least, that's what one of his prison confidants claims. And whether or not that's true, it was the reality Gainesville found itself in. 5 coeds had been killed in their apartments. Their bodies were mutilated and grotesquely laid out, painting a story of terror, pain, and humiliation. Fear gripped the college town as news of the shocking murders dominated the headlines. Danny's criminal career began long before the Gainesville murders, though. In fact, Gainesville wasn't even the first town to see Danny's brutality. Almost 10 months before the coed killings, he committed an equally as grisly murder in Shreveport, Louisiana. But that's not all. Danny was also a known peeper, alcoholic, and drug addict, and armed robber. And to top all of it off, he was also a coward. Welcome back, Scissor Sisters. The depravity of the Gainesville Ripper is as shocking as you'd imagine. And it will be even more shocking if I don't finish these dang Daisy Square overalls while I tell you about him. Some people are born into loving families, and some people aren't. Maybe if Danny had had someone who loved him enough to crochet him something whimsical, we wouldn't be here talking about him today. Daniel Harold Rolling was born to Korean War vet James Rolling and homemaker Claudia Rolling on May 26, 1954. His little brother Kevin was born just 15 months later. Armed with a temper and unchecked PTSD, James beat his family frequently. For Claudia, the abuse began as soon as she said "I do." She was screamed at, beaten, and demeaned on a daily basis. For the boys, it began around the time that they could crawl. According to Claudia, they were physically beaten about once a week and verbally demeaned daily. The abuse put quite a strain on James and Claudia's relationship. She had actually tried to leave James quite a few times, but she always ended up going back. Eventually, she got tired of running and repeating the cycle, so the unhappy family settled in Shreveport, Louisiana when Danny was around 6. James got a job as a police officer, and Claudia worked part-time, low-wage jobs while her boys were in school. And even though James had promised it would, the abuse never stopped. James never wanted a family to begin with. He knew all too well that family didn't necessarily mean love or safety. As a boy, James spent a lot of time with his grandparents. And one day, when he was around 5 or 6, James watched his grandfather slit his grandmother's throat while she soaked her feet. Witnessing that murder young taught him that violence was synonymous with love, and he passed that lesson on to his sons. His PTSD-fueled temper would get so out of control that he even beat Danny in the front yard on more than one occasion. The neighbors watched this distorted display of love every time. But what could they have done? The man doing the beating was the man wearing the badge, and the woman who had the power to stop it kept going back to him. So watching was the only thing they could do. These lessons in love were hard on Danny, so by 14, he had a drinking problem. His criminal career began earlier than that, though. He and his friends had been caught shoplifting from a mall by the age of 12, and those same friends introduced Danny to peeping when he was 15. Peeping quickly became Danny's favorite pastime, and he would often imagine himself as part of the families he watched instead of his own dysfunctional one. Even as a teenager, Danny was regularly beaten by his father. The violence that defined his life pushed him to a breaking point one day, and at 15, Danny locked himself in the bathroom, wrote a suicide note on the mirror with his mother's lipstick, and slit his wrists. He survived the attempt and dropped out of high school shortly after that. I think we can imagine how hit-happy James felt about his son's life choices. Before he was even able to legally drive a car, Danny had been caught stealing, peeping, and drinking, had attempted suicide, and had dropped out of high school. In 1971, at the age of 17, Danny decided to join the United States Air Force, signing on as military police. Of all the choices he could have made, Danny chose to follow in his father's footsteps. Maybe he thought that he could finally make James proud by choosing the same career. Or maybe he thought that the military would toughen him up enough to finally stand up to his father. It doesn't really matter either way, though, because James still loathed that Danny was even born. Young, independent, and damaged, Danny used the freedom he had under the Air Force to party his days away. He felt more freedom in the military than he ever did at home. But as they always do, the bad habits caught up to him, and by 1972, Danny was discharged from the military because he couldn't seem to stay sober. His commanding officer would tell his mother that Danny just didn't have the maturity for life in the military. Jobless and broke, Danny returned to his parents' house in Shreveport. Once he was settled back in, Danny started to get really into church, like weirdly obsessed with it. He would attend sermons up to 5 times a week and became a very active member in the congregation. All of his activity within the church led to Danny meeting his future wife, Omather Halko, at a singles event hosted by the church in March of 1974. Danny believed she was the answer to his prayers, claiming that he prayed for a wife and there was Omather. The two married 6 months later on September 7th at just 19 years old. Despite being a married man and a religious zealot, Danny kept up his late-night vices. He even managed to maintain them after his daughter was born in 1975. If only Omather had known what she had gotten herself into. Omather said that Danny was kind and sweet when they dated, but things quickly soured after the wedding. Once they had tied the knot, she learned that Danny was incredibly lazy, like refused to get out of bed to go to work lazy. But that was the least of her worries, honestly. Police officers dropped by her house one afternoon to inform her that Danny had been caught peeping on a neighbor the previous night. When Omather confronted Danny, he hit her. And as they do, things only escalated and got worse from there. During another fight, Danny pulled a shotgun on O'Mather and threatened to shoot her. O'Mather took their daughter and left shortly after that incident, and can I say thank God, because he probably would have killed her. That fight was the last time Danny ever saw his daughter. The divorce was finalized in 1977, and Danny did not take it well. The loss of his wife and daughter left him with more alone time than ever before, and instead of taking up a new hobby like crochet, Danny Rolling decided to become an armed robber, a traveling armed robber at that. In May 1979, Danny robbed a liquor store in Shreveport, then a grocery store in Montgomery, Alabama, then a grocery store and someone's house in Columbus, Georgia, on the same night. He was arrested in the car he stole from the house that he robbed later that same night. Danny was given a 6-year sentence at Georgia State Prison in June 1979. Release came in 1985, and Danny was a free man for about a month before he was arrested yet again for the armed robbery of a grocery store in Mississippi. Danny was given a 6-year sentence at the Georgia State Prison in June 1979. Release came in 1985, and Danny was a free man for about a month before he was arrested yet again for the armed robbery of a Mississippi grocery store. He was given a 4-year sentence at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in March 1986. At his sentencing hearing, Danny pleaded with the judge to cut off his hands instead of sending him back to prison. After his release in 1988, Danny made his way back to Shreveport to live with his parents again. He served a total of 8 years to never get more than $300 from any one robbery. As you can imagine, James wasn't thrilled his son had moved back in. Not only had he not even wanted to be a father to begin with, but now one of his sons was a felonious high school dropout who couldn't hold a job. It led to near constant fighting in the Rolling household. But other than fighting with his father, the next year and a half or so was relatively quiet for Danny. He started dating again, he worked a variety of jobs around Shreveport, he slipped back into his drug and alcohol habit, and he continued on with some less than innocent peeping. All of these vices and the violence at home compounded until he reached a breaking point. On November 4th, 1989, Danny followed 24-year-old Julie Grissom home, and what ensued was a bloodbath. Danny had been wandering around the mall when he noticed Julie working at a department store. She was young, beautiful, and coincidentally, a student at Louisiana State University in Shreveport. Danny decided to follow her home, where her 55-year-old father, Tom, and 8-year-old nephew, Sean, were having a barbecue. All 3 of them would die that night, and their bodies wouldn't be found for the next 2 days. Now, these murders were especially hard for the Grissom family, for more than just the obvious reasons. Sean's father had just gotten back from his honeymoon the day of the murders. Tom had agreed to keep Sean through the end of the weekend to allow the newlyweds more time to themselves. He even agreed to get Sean to school on Monday morning. When Monday morning came and Sean didn't show up for school, his mother got a call. The school was probably expecting to hear that the boy was sick, not that his mother had no idea where he was. Sean's mother tried to call Tom, but nobody answered. I can't imagine how she must have felt in those moments. She ended up calling in a wellness check when she just couldn't get a hold of anybody. When police entered Tom's house, they found something shocking. First, they found the 55-year-old in his laundry room with 5 stabs to the chest. When they moved further in, they found Sean in the den. 8-year-old Sean had been stabbed through the back with so much force that the knife passed fully through his body and into the floor. He was lying on his stomach watching TV when he was attacked. And then there was Julie. She was found on her bed, stabbed, slashed, raped, and posed. The discovery of Julie's body is what made this case unforgettable. The attack on her living body was brutal enough, but the desecration of her corpse takes this to a whole new level. She was laid on her back, arms above her head, and knees spread wide. Her hair was fanned out above her head, and she had deep bite marks on her breasts. The killer had taken the time to clean her body with vinegar before leaving. All of that was discovered because a little boy missed school. Police tried to link someone to the case, but it quickly went cold. Julie's ex-boyfriend, 39-year-old Hal Carter, was briefly a person of interest, but he was cleared almost immediately. Hal was able to provide gas station receipts showing he was in Atlanta, Georgia at the time of the murder. He packed up and he moved to Washington State 6 weeks later. I seriously cannot stress enough how quickly Hal was ruled out as a legitimate suspect. The police aren't going to let someone that they think committed a grisly triple homicide just pack up and move across the country 6 weeks after a murder. It's just not going to happen. Nevertheless, Hal ended up making Julie's murder his entire personality. He dated her for 3 months, and they had been broken up at the time of the murder, and he has done nothing but capitalize and make money off of it since. Danny, on the other hand, stayed in Shreveport. As it turned out, his parents happened to live just about a half-mile from the Grissom house. For the next 6 months, he carried on with his life like nothing had happened at all. May 1990 was the catalyst for the Gainesville murders. One afternoon, Danny put his foot on a bench in the kitchen to tie his shoe, and James, the ever-patient and loving father, started to tear into Danny. The 36-year-old decided he wasn't going to take his father's verbal assault this time and dared him to do something about it. That is when the fight escalated and James pulled a gun on Danny and chased him into the yard. According to the neighbors, Danny ran from the house with James hot on his heels, waving his gun and shouting. Danny ran across the road to a shed, pulled out his own gun, and ran back to his parents' yard. He shot his father with a handgun in the head and the stomach and then fled. Claudia said she remembered hearing 4 shots go off, but claimed she closed her eyes when James pulled the gun on Danny. And when she opened them again, James was on the kitchen floor bleeding. The police lieutenant would lose sight in one eye and hearing in one ear, but he'd still live long enough to bury his own son. James Rolling took a bullet to the head and lived for another 22 years. That's insane. For the next 3 months, Danny was a drifter. He robbed his way across the southern United States before settling in Florida in July of 1990. One of his first stops was the military surplus store in Tallahassee. He bought a K-bar knife under a fake name and moved on to the next city, camping in the woods as he traveled. His wandering would put him in Gainesville in August 1990 and place him directly in the paths of his victims. Everything that has happened so far has been like the opening act for something truly horrific and terrifying. Hold on to your scissors and hooks. The University of Florida pulls thousands of students to its campus every year, with more freshmen enrolling than the campus can house, which is how 17-year-old Christina Powell and 18-year-old Sonia Larson ended up getting an off-campus apartment in Gainesville. The two had met over the summer and became fast friends. Sonia was described as affectionate and as someone who just radiated love. She wanted to be an elementary school teacher. Her roommate, Christina, was known as Christy to her friends. She had dreams of becoming a civil engineer, specifically to design houses for low-income families. They hadn't even finished orientation week when their dreams were ripped from them. In the pre-dawn hours of Friday, August 24th, 1990, Danny Rolling snuck in through the freshman's unlocked back door. When he entered the living room, he found Christina asleep on the couch. He stood over her for a moment and watched her sleep before moving down the hallway and into Sonia's room. Danny attacked Sonia in her bed as she slept. He stabbed her with one hand as he slapped tape over her mouth with another. Sonia tried to fight, which led to a deep slice across her thigh. She was stabbed 17 times before Danny was done with her, at least for a little while. Danny then walked back to the living room and attacked Christina. Danny slapped tape over her mouth, taped her hands behind her back, and raped her at knife point. When he was finished, Danny threw Christina off the couch and onto the floor. With her face down, Danny stabbed Christina 5 times in the back. Once she died, he set to work posing the bodies. Danny helped himself to an apple and a banana from their kitchen and then left. It didn't take long for him to strike again. 18-year-old Krista Hoyt was a sophomore at Santa Fe Community College with dreams of becoming a police detective. She loved the community she wanted to protect so much that she took a job as a file clerk at the local sheriff's department. It was one of her work friends that would discover her body days after the attack. Around 10 p.m. on Saturday, August 25th, Danny broke into Krista's empty apartment with a screwdriver. While Danny waited, he rearranged Krista's home, moving a bookshelf from the kitchen to the bedroom. Krista came home an hour later after a night of playing racquetball with her friend. Danny took Krista by surprise, silencing her with a piece of tape over her mouth. And then he bound her hands behind her back and raped her. Danny stabbed her once through the back and mutilated her corpse. He used her shower, left, re-entered the home to look for his wallet, and then decided he would decapitate her. So, yeah, he left first, came back, and then decided to further mutilate her. If you're curious what Danny was up to in between those two murders, then you'll be delighted to hear that he was doing very mundane things like sleeping and going to the movies. Meanwhile, the rest of Gainesville didn't even know that it was supposed to be afraid yet. It took 2 days, but someone finally decided to check in on Sonia and Christina. Neither girl had checked in with their families since Thursday morning. Both families were worried, but it was when Christina missed lunch with her parents that everyone knew something was wrong. On Sunday afternoon, August 26th, the staff at the Williamsburg Apartments called for an officer to assist a maintenance worker with opening a door. Ray Barber, the responding officer, had seen concerned parents panic over kids who forgot to call home before, so he assumed that this would be something like that. He knew he was wrong, though, when maintenance unlocked the door and he saw Christina Powell grotesquely posed in front of him. Christina was naked on the living room floor. Her knees were bent to the side so that her pubic region was on full display. Her hands had been positioned above her head and her hair was fanned out above her shoulder. And most disturbingly, Christina's nipples had been sliced off and placed just above her left shoulder. A towel was rolled up and found between her legs, and soap was found on her vulva. Thankfully, her parents were still in the parking lot and were spared the sight of seeing their daughter like that. Sonia was found in the bedroom upstairs, posed just as lewdly. Her arms had been draped over her bed frame, her head pushed back so that her hair could fan out on the bed above her. Sonia's yellow shirt was pulled up over her breasts and her panties were thrown against the door. I can see how police connected Danny to the Shreveport murders so quickly after he had been arrested. This thing with the hair that he has going on is just such a weirdly specific detail. Just hours later, around 1 a.m. on Monday, August 27th, Krista's body was found. She hadn't shown up for her shift at the sheriff's office, so Officer Gail Barber went to check on the college student. With the discovery of Christina and Sonia's bodies earlier in the day, they wanted to make sure that their young coworker was okay. More than that, though, Gail wanted to check on her friend. And yes, Gail Barber is the wife of Ray Barber. How crazy is it that a husband and wife working separate shifts found the bodies for victims from the same murder practically on the same day? Like, that, gotta admit, that's a crazy detail there. Krista's apartment was more or less a mother-in-law suite in someone's backyard. You could only access it by a locked gate, which the landlord opened when the police car cruised up and asked for his tenant. When they got to the house, they noticed that the blinds that covered the sliding glass door didn't quite reach the bottom. There was about an 18-inch gap. And through that 18-inch gap, they were able to see the naked body of Krista in her bedroom, which gave them probable cause to enter. If the bodies of the previous Ripper victims were mutilated, then I am going to need a stronger word for what Danny did to Krista's body. She was found seated on the edge of her bed, feet flat on the floor, body slumped over so that it was resting on her knees. She had been cut from breastbone to pubic bone, and her head sat on a bookshelf overlooking her dead body that was on the bed. Her vulva had been cleaned with soap, but sperm was still found inside her vaginal canal. While Gainesville police were still reeling from these barbaric murders, Danny was committing yet another double homicide. At 3 a.m., just 2 hours after Krista's body was discovered, Danny broke into the apartment of high school friends Manny Taboda and Tracy Pauls. Manny had hopes of becoming an architect and worked hard towards his goals. He had graduated high school with honors while playing football, and as a college student, he bartended at Bennigan's to support himself. He was described as persistent and popular. His roommate, Tracy, was equally as charismatic. She was beautiful and kind. She had graduated high school as the salutatorian and was pursuing a law degree through the University of Florida. She had just gotten home from whitewater rafting in Tennessee with her sister on the day she was murdered. Danny broke into the apartment on Monday, August 27th, forcing his way in through the locked sliding glass door. Manny was asleep on his back when Danny attacked. And for whatever reason, Danny didn't use tape to try to silence Manny like he had with the others. Manny grabbed at Danny, calling him a bastard and a son of a bitch. He fought like hell, but ultimately he succumbed to his injuries and Danny overpowered him and killed him. Manny sustained 31 stab wounds and died in less than a minute. And all of that commotion woke up Tracy. Poor Tracy had opened her door and headed down the hall with the intent of helping Manny. But as soon as she saw Danny, she knew something was wrong. She sprinted back to her room and locked the door. Danny broke it down. When he entered, she asked, "You're him, aren't you?" And he said, "Yeah, I am." How fucking scary, dude. How scary. Oh my God. Tracy had just learned about the other murders hours earlier. Just like the women before her, Tracy's hands and mouth were taped. She was raped and then stabbed through the back on her bed. Danny dragged her dead body into the hallway, wiped the blood from her face, and raped her again. When he was done, Danny douched her to wash away the evidence. He swapped his bloody t-shirt for one of Manny's muscle shirts and threw his bloodied one in Tracy's room and left. After leaving Manny and Tracy's apartment, Danny buried the knife and gloves he used for the murders behind a chicken coop within a mile of the last crime scene. Danny made his way to his campsite 3 miles away, just as dawn broke. The horror in Gainesville was over, but the fear itself was just beginning to grip the town. You'd think that a late night filled with rape and murder would really wipe someone out, but it didn't slow Danny down at all. That same afternoon, Danny and his drug dealer, Tony Danzy, had robbed the First Union National Bank in Gainesville. Danny stashed his portion of their haul in a duffel bag at his campsite. The two were found by police later that same day. Police approached as they walked through a parking lot. Tony stopped and agreed to be searched, but Danny ran straight to his campsite, leading detectives to the evidence they would need to later put him away for the Gainesville murders, but they didn't know that yet. A screwdriver, a gun, a cassette tape, a roll of duct tape, and the stolen cash were all logged into evidence. While one team searched Danny's campsite, the other team began their investigation at the Gatorwood Apartments. Tracy was the type of person who kept her promises. So when she hadn't called a friend back by Tuesday, her friend knew that something was seriously wrong. The concerned friend went to check on Tracy, but without a key, they needed help getting in. It was the unsuspecting maintenance man who went to open the door for Tracy's friend who found the bodies. The nightmare that began on Friday, August 24th, ended with the discovery of Manny's and Tracy's bodies on Tuesday, August 28th. In 3 days, Danny committed 5 murders and an armed robbery. That's insane. He probably needed all of the drugs he bought from Tony to keep himself awake for all of that. Tracy was found in the hallway of her apartment next to the bathroom. She was naked and was found with a rolled up towel between her legs. Why is this so crooked? Oh my goodness. A curling iron and a paper bag were found near her body, and sperm was found near her anal cavity. A trail of blood led from her body next to the bathroom to her bedroom. Her bedroom door had been smashed in and the curtains had been taped shut. Danny's blood-soaked shirt sat on the floor. And unlike Danny's other victims, Tracy wasn't posed and her breasts weren't mutilated. Manny was found further down the hall in his bedroom. He was lying flat on his back, soaked in his own blood. Danny hadn't even attempted to move Manny's body. And all of that was discovered because a girl didn't call her friend back. If you're wondering why Danny took the time to mutilate and pose all of his female victims except for Tracy, then you're not alone. Investigators actually had the same question, and when they asked, Danny simply said that he had no need to mutilate her because he was done after her. He claimed that he took a life for every year that he was in prison, and because Tracy was the last victim, the cycle was broken and there was no need to mutilate or pose her. The police took that as a throwaway comment, but what if it was a much deeper confession than investigators initially realized? I mean, it sounds to me like a quiet confession to the Grissom murders. As you can imagine, the police were desperate to find the monster who did this. Students were scared and parents were demanding justice. In a city with a large transient population, the culprit could literally be anywhere. So when 18-year-old Edward Humphrey was arrested for assaulting his grandmother on August 30th, investigators immediately began trying to link him to the Gainesville murders. And to be fair, Humphrey was a pretty good suspect. He had a history of assault and peeping, and he had recently been kicked out of the same apartment complex that Manny and Tracy lived in. If it weren't for the fact that Humphrey's blood type didn't match the blood found at the scenes, I could see why he'd be the main suspect. Humphrey was still held under suspicion for the murders until June 1991, which was about 5 months after Danny had been linked to them. On September 7th, 1990, Danny was arrested in Ocala for robbing a grocery store. He was held at the Marion County Jail and had a tooth pulled while he waited for sentencing. As Danny waited, the task force that had been put together to find him worked. DNA from the extracted tooth linked Danny to the Gainesville murders in January 1991. News coverage of the murders had swept the nation, giving investigators in Shreveport the lead they needed to connect him to the Grissom murders. Initially, Danny pled not guilty to the charges he was facing in Gainesville. He spent the next 3 years building his defense. Their main tactic was to portray Danny as just some mentally unstable dude. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder and claimed he had the emotional maturity of a 15-year-old, which is a claim his former commanding officer validated. Danny himself claimed to have multiple personalities, saying that Jesse and Enad were morally ambiguous, while Gemini was outright evil. Not a single psychiatrist who interviewed Danny thought he had multiple personalities, partly because his evil personality was pulled straight out of The Exorcist 3. Danny genuinely thought that spelling his name backwards and pulling a character from a horror movie he watched recently would be enough to absolve him, so I guess he is kind of crazy. The defense pulled testimonies from Danny's family and ex-wife, trying to establish a pattern of erratic behavior and abuse against him. Claudia and her sister testified to the abuse Danny endured growing up. His ex-wife, O'Mather, testified to Danny's erratic and unpredictable behavior. These testimonies were the foundation of his defense. In the weeks leading up to his trial, Danny had told his attorneys that he wanted to change his plea. They begged him not to. In anticipation of a long trial, the defense had put in a request for a change of venue, which was denied. The trial began on February 15th, 1994, and Danny shocked the courtroom by changing his plea without the knowledge of his lawyers. The trial jury was then pardoned, and jury selection for Danny's sentencing began. Now, all that was left to decide was whether Danny deserved the death penalty or not. The defense was now fighting for Danny's life. They reasoned with the jury that Danny's personality disorder mixed with his cocaine usage during the weeks of the murder and his shitty childhood, all left him mentally incompetent. And while all of that is absolutely true, it doesn't necessarily account for the sheer brutality we saw during the attacks. That explanation doesn't account for so many key details, like Danny re-entering Krista's house after he killed her, or why he took food from Sonia's and Christina's apartment. It doesn't explain why he hid the murder weapon or why he decapitated a teenager. No level of cocaine is going to make you do that if you don't already have that type of savagery in you. Most importantly, Danny's defense argued that he shouldn't receive the death penalty because he was sorry for what he had done. The prosecution had a much easier time building their case. They were trying to prove that Danny was dangerous, which was easy to do with his prior felony convictions, the sexual battery, and the overall brutality of the case. But they took it a step further and pushed the idea that the attacks were premeditated, and in the cases of Sonia Larson and Manny Taboda, to avoid being caught, meaning that he was in his right mind because he had to plan to kill these people. But even if Danny hadn't pled guilty, the prosecution wouldn't have had a hard time putting him away. The tape found at the campsite contained Krista's pubic hair, and they had sperm and blood samples from the crime scenes that linked Danny to most of the scenes. And that's not even including Danny's full confession. In January 1993, Danny had confessed to the murders through his friend, Bobby Lewis. According to Danny, Bobby was his mouthpiece and confessor. Over a 3-hour period, Danny told law enforcement everything they wanted to know about the Gainesville murders through Bobby, whispering answers to questions in Bobby's ear or adding affirmations for the detectives where necessary. Danny Rolling was ultimately given the death penalty on April 20th, 1994. A death sentence wasn't the end for Danny, though. In fact, he had a life in prison this time around. His notoriety as the Gainesville Ripper landed him an interview with true crime journalist Sandra London. Sandra wanted Danny's story, and he loved her attention. Eventually, they got engaged, and Sandra got to sell Danny's story. Nevertheless, Sandra was his favorite obsession. But she wasn't the only thing occupying his mind. When he wasn't making googly eyes at Sandra, Danny was applying for appeals. He felt that it was impossible for him to have an impartial jury in Alachua County, and that the judge denying his change of venue request directly led to his imprisonment. Obviously, that appeal was denied. He tried it a second time, and he was denied again. His final attempt at an appeal came just months before his execution. He tried to claim that lethal injection made him anxious, so it was inhumane. Obviously, that appeal was denied too. 47 people watched the lethal injection on October 25th, 2006, including the surviving Grissoms. Louisiana built a case against Danny for the triple homicide, but never brought any charges against him. Danny chose to sing "None Greater Than Thee, O Lord, None Greater Than Thee" as his last words. Moments before his death, Danny handed his chaplain a note confessing to the Grissom murders. Take that as you will, but to me, that was Danny's final attempt to get a stay of execution. I mean, we know he's a coward. I think he just wanted to avoid the death penalty. I really do. Gainesville and Hal Carter collectively breathed a sigh of relief. After 16 years, the nightmare that was the Gainesville Ripper had finally ended. His crime spree had left the town terrorized, with only a concrete wall to memorialize the five coeds who had been brutally attacked in their apartment. In the end, Daniel Harold Rolling was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of sexual battery, and 3 counts of armed robbery. But he was guilty of far more. Almost 40 years later, a monument to the victims still stands. Their families still help tend to the memorial, refusing to let the memory of their loved ones die. I just have this last little panel here to sew onto it and the straps, so I will likely finish this project off camera. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Come back soon for a new story and a new project. And remember to choose kindness where you can. Bye.